So I decided, first of all, thank you for that introduction. I decided that since no one sat in the front row, with the exception of our speakers, that I'm going to bring the stage a little closer to you, if that's all right. It also helps me see what slides are on the screen, so it's a bit of a trick. Well, first of all, it's an absolute delight to be here. I couldn't agree with Mike more about this being the most important meeting happening in South Carolina, and I'll tell you why I think it is from my viewpoint. Because in this room is a gathering that rarely happens in our country today, and that is a conference that brings together policymakers, nonprofit sector participants, employers, and the education sector in the same room. Just pause on that point for a bit and realize how rare that alone is, right? I'm going to talk about huge disconnects between our education system writ large and our employers writ large. I'm going to show you all kinds of evidence that there's very little real collaboration going on across this thing that we could potentially turn into the world's greatest human development pipeline. But on a simple level, we're not even communicating with one another because we rarely have forums like this. I go to a lot of conferences that are focused on higher education, and in that, it's a conference just for provosts. There's another conference for chief business officers. There's another, you get the idea, K-12 conferences. There's one for this, there's one for that. Rarely do we have opportunities to bring all of the key stakeholders together. So first of all, kudos to South Carolina for doing that, and it's a pleasure to be here. So the title of my talk is about this idea of building an educonomy. And the vision is a relatively simple vision, and that is that this would be a seamless pipeline from birth until death that involves a process of lifelong learning and contribution to society, which for most of us is through a thing we call job or work. But obviously we know there's all kinds of important roles that people play that are not necessarily in full-time employed jobs the way we think about the classic definition. But the idea here is that if we did that right, there would be seamless linkages between early childhood learning programs, our K-12 system, our higher education system, and employers of all shapes and sizes. Now, a lot of times when we have this conversation, when we think about education to work, we're thinking in very narrow terms about for-profit businesses and high-paying jobs. I'm talking about the whole thing. And of course, the irony is that we have nothing that resembles this vision right now because we barely follow a student from elementary school to middle school in the same school district. I mean, think about this. In the same school district, a student moves from an elementary school to a middle school or a middle school to a high school. And it's almost like an entire reset on what we know about that student, the relationships that that student built or didn't build, right? I mean, we barely help usher them in an effective way from one school to another in the same school district, let alone thinking about the transition from, say, college or university into a workplace. So that's the vision. And before I start diving into a lot of this stuff, I always love to start with kind of a grounding question. And this is one that I hope grounds us all in our thinking about this. So this is actually my favorite Gallup poll question that we've ever asked. This was a question from our daily poll, and we rarely ask open-ended questions. Usually we ask a question and there's a series of responses that you can choose. This was an open-ended one, so I'm going to ask all of you to participate if you don't mind. So here was the question. We actually started with a prompt. We said, think about the best teacher that you've ever had. And then we said, put that person's name in your head. So I'd like everybody to do that right now. Think of the best teacher you've ever had. Put that person's name in your head. Now, the first interesting observation is that none of you took more than a split second to come up with that name, did you? It's just instant. And the only trouble you might have had is that you might have had 3 or 4 names come to mind, but you had no trouble whatsoever instantly coming up with a name for your best teacher. So then here's the open-ended question we asked. We said, what was it about him or her that made them your best teacher? And we just listened to what Americans said. Do you want to know what the #1 word was that Americans used to describe their best teacher? #1, the most most often used word when we listen to what they said in an open-ended response. I'm not a psychic, but I can predict what many of you are thinking when you think about those words. Any ideas what that word is? The number one word Americans use. Have you seen this data before, or you just... About 30 of you yelled out care. And that's the answer. Now, on one hand, you go, oh, Brandon, that's just a simple old Gallup poll. What's the big deal? On the other hand, you go, no, listen, this is the voice of Americans talking about their best teacher, and the thing they cite as being the nexus of why that happened, right, is this word care. So I'm just going to ask you all a simple question to start off right now. How are we measuring care in schools? See, we want to be competitive, and we want to compete, and we want to win, but now the question becomes, what do we want to compete and win on? And I worry right now that our education system, the way we have set it up by the metrics we use to measure the performance of students and teachers in schools, is based on a very, very narrow set of metrics. And I'm not going to suggest that we throw these out, not at all. But what I'm saying is that the ones we're using right now, although necessary, are horribly insufficient. And this is where I will start my case. The first question is, what is our definition of success? This is so important. It's so important through the lens of an individual student, for his or her parents or guardians, right? For teachers to think about this, for all of us to think carefully about what do we mean by success. Because see, right now, if you weren't careful, you'd think about the definition of success for a student is going to college. See, every school district says their goal is to make students college and career ready, but what they really mean is college ready, because career ready is not something that we hold up as a really high goal to attain for a lot of people right out of high school. By the way, college is not for everybody. I believe in the power of higher education. I believe in the power of lifelong learning. There are so many different ways to achieve lifelong learning that don't necessarily go through the traditional path of an 18 to 22-year-old showing up on a 4-year residential private liberal arts campus, which is the vision that we have in our head for most of us in college today. Here's a news flash. 75% of all college students enrolled in higher education today in the United States are non-traditional age students. They are, in essence, working adults. So when we think about this 18 to 22-year-old, true, they are part of the population of higher education, but they are a quarter of the students enrolled in higher education. So don't think students equals kids. Students equals a lot of different demographics the way we think about it. Our definition of success right now is the prestige of the college you go to, not just going to college, right, but does it have a brand name? And then on top of that, it's how much money do you make when you get out of college? And maybe the prestige of the company that you go work for. Now, believe me, prestige in those ways has some value in our country. I'm not saying it doesn't have any value, but it's more proxy value than it is qualitative value, and I'll explain more about what I mean. But if our only measure of success is the grades that students get, the test scores they achieve, and how much money they earn, we lose sight of so many other elements that are important for human development, not just for children, but for all of us along our entire course of life. So the beauty of working at a place like Gallup is that we're doing studies across K-12, into higher education, into the workplace. We're studying the well-being of the entire planet. I kid you not, we actually run what we call our world poll, where we're statistically sampling 99% of the world's adult population every year, which means we have representative sampling frames set up in almost every single country around the world. And it all started 75 plus years ago with this guy, George Gallup, who, by the way, his original research obsession was not trying to predict the horse race in the presidential campaign. It was trying to quantify what he called a life well lived. And I love the way he describes it. We call it well-being today, just for purposes of giving it a one-word description, but it's essentially trying to quantify what it means to have a life well lived. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit because it's a bit of a hint towards careful what we measure. We become what we measure, and if all we're measuring is grades and test scores and earnings, those are very important outcomes, but they're horribly insufficient in and of themselves. So let me just take you into this a little bit. On one hand, we're actually using input measures today to judge the best colleges and universities. What do I mean? If you look at college ratings and rankings that are out there, a lot of them put enormous weight on the incoming test scores and grades and rank in class of students before they arrive. So these institutions get more points in the weighting scheme based on how high the SAT scores are, rank in class, and grades that the students get before they arrive at the university. We put that in a formula, and we say, here's the top universities in the country. This is just unbelievable this is true. No one has ever measured the learning growth of students from the time they matriculate to the time they graduate. On that, we have no idea what the best colleges and universities are because we've never tried to measure that. What do we put in there? Student-faculty ratios, size of the endowment, test scores before they arrived. Who knows? Maybe the Ivy League is just the best because all we're measuring is test scores, and they had the best test scores on the way in. They had the best grades and test scores on the way out. These are just fantastic students. It's an interesting question that we should be asking. And I'm not saying that it doesn't matter, because obviously those kinds of things sort in successful outcomes in life in a number of different ways. But there's a lot of interesting developments taking place that are going to start to shift our thinking on this big time. So on one hand, we're using inputs to measure what the best colleges and universities are. On the other hand, our output measures, our outcome measures, are incredibly limited in scope. So it's important that we track things like graduation rates and grades and to some degree test scores. But see, what we're not measuring is what happens after that. Because for the average American, the number one reason why they're interested in going to higher education, go to higher education, or are enrolled in higher education, number one reason, to get a good job. So here's the important thing to understand. If they graduate and get a diploma that doesn't end up in getting them a good job or a better job, that is a failure in that graduate's grade book. So although a diploma is an important flag that we want people to knock over, it's not the end-all, be-all goal that people have in going to higher education. Sure, yes, I want to get a diploma, I want to graduate, but what do I really want? I want to propel myself to a better career, a better life, right? And if you read the mission statements of colleges and universities, they talk about these things. I've actually read over 1,000 college mission statements. It's a hobby of mine. I know it's a sick hobby. But just do this for 5 or 10 of them, right? Go to the mission statement of your own institution. They post them everywhere. It's not hard to find these things. You know the most commonly used words in a college mission statement? This is a good little factoid. It's lifelong learning. So you go, okay, if that's the number one word professed in the mission statement of college and universities, how are they measuring whether that's happening or not? This is a fair question because they've put it in their mission statement. Well, the honest answer is, really, I'm being a little harsh, no one has ever tried to measure that. And if they have, it's been a very minor example. Maybe there's a couple universities out there that did a survey of alumni and asked them how many books they read in the last month or something like that. Great step forward. But writ large, higher education is not even measuring some of the most important elements of its mission statement. Now, I'm not saying this is a measure of lifelong learning, but Gallup asked a question. This was the statement: I learn or do something interesting each day. And respondents were asked to strongly agree, 5-point scale, strongly disagree. So I'm not suggesting this is the end-all, be-all measure of lifelong learning, but it's a pretty interesting question, isn't it? I learn or do something interesting each day. You would think that college graduates are more likely to strongly agree to that question than people without a college degree. That's not true. There is no statistical difference between people with a bachelor's degree strongly agreeing to that question than somebody without a bachelor's degree. The only difference that starts to appear is if you have a postgraduate degree. And people with postgraduate degrees are slightly more likely to say they learn or do something interesting each day. So if we just start there, right, we need to think carefully about whether we're delivering on our mission. And obviously our mission statements go way beyond the things that we think of college. Here's a good stat. We know that if you get a bachelor's degree, on average, you make $850,000 more over your lifetime than someone who doesn't get one. Now, that is not an unimportant finding. In terms of economic success, a college degree is a pretty big difference maker in the grand scheme of things. But is that the only way that you, in this room, I'm going to ask all of you the question, measure your life and your success and fulfillment and rewards? No. I mean, for some of you, it matters more than others. But here's the interesting thing. when Gallup studies something like well-being, well-being doesn't go up over $75,000 a year in annual income. Now, up to $75,000, you've got a little return on your well-being investment. After that, there's no difference in the likelihood that you rate or evaluate your life any better than someone who makes, say, $400,000 a year, et cetera, right? So we know that when it comes to well-being, we know that we measure things like workplace engagement, not just do you have a job, but are you emotionally engaged in your work in your workplace? That has no relationship with your pay. It has no relationship with benefits. It has no relationship with whether there's a latte machine in the break room or whether there's a Segway scooter to tool around in the hallway with or a volleyball court outside, right? We think these are things that millennials want. Absolutely not. You know what the number one thing millennials want out of the workplace? Growth and development. That's it. There's your whole story. But you see how leaders get it wrong when they think the latte machines and the volleyball courts are the big drivers of what makes people happy at work? Forget about it. It's whether they feel that they're learning and growing. So I'm just sprinkling a lot of these things at you, and I'm going to keep hitting you with a number of these things. But see, it turns out that hope, one's ideas and energy for the future, as it is defined, is a stronger predictor of college success than SAT scores, ACT scores, and high school GPA. And so a lot of people start to go, what did you say? So usually in the back, somebody can't hear, and they go, did you say hope? And I say, yeah, I did. And so here's the thing. Hope, like measures of grit, engagement, well-being, these are all words that sound like real soft, fluffy things. The first hang-up we have is people don't think you can measure them. Patently untrue. You can reliably measure all of these things. The second thing people get hung up on is they go, okay, maybe you can measure those things, but do they really matter? The answer is absolutely. These are not soft measures. These are hard measures in terms of their ability to predict key performance on any level that we've ever tested it. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. So now as I start to shift from our report card on grades and test scores and graduation rates in the United States and start to show you how we're doing on something like student engagement in school, things start to actually feel even more troubling than we probably think they are. Because Gallup, through our Gallup student poll, we just surveyed about 1 million 5th through 12th graders this past October. And here's what engagement in school looks like from elementary school to middle school to high school. It goes down every single year. Now, the way we measure engagement is a number of items to get at their emotional engagement in their learning, right, in their school place, right, the kinds of connections they have with the human beings that are part of that process. What's interesting is that on a couple of the key items, some of the most important items, I would argue, through our research for human development, they score horribly. So here's one. I have a chance to do what I'm best at each day. 34% of 5th graders strongly agree to that. By 11th grade, it drops to 17%. Let me just run that by you again. Barely a third of 5th graders say they have a chance to do what they're best at each day in school, and by the time they get to 11th grade, it's a mere 17%. It drops in half from 5th to 11th grade. 12th grade looks like 11th grade. So the slide goes from 5th to 11 and basically stops there. Now, the other question that I would argue is the second most important question in the world. I have a mentor who encourages my development. 49% of 5th graders strongly agree to that, and that drops to 25% by 11th grade. I share both of these because through the lens of our work, by the way, these are the two most important questions for you today, right? It doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter race, religion, culture, what country you're from. If you strongly agree you have a chance to do what you're best at each day, and you strongly agree you have someone who encourages your development, I can tell you with almost certainty that you are thriving in your well-being and engaged in your work. The odds that you're not are almost zero. By the way, if you can't strongly agree to both of those questions, think about this through the lens of self-efficacy, of how you might be able to get to that place. Maybe you're in a job where you got a bum manager. That's actually one of the challenges for most people in terms of their workplace engagement. The number one driver of whether they're engaged in work is their manager. They either have a manager who encourages their development, helps them figure out what they're best at, creates a role or evolves their role so that they can do more of that each day, right? But the point here is that these are things that happen to us. They're also things that we can play a role in controlling. It's the same thing with students as well. Just think about college students, for example. They have choices to pick classes. Right now, they pick classes based on what kinds of classes they need to graduate. Here's some good advice. Pick the professor, not the class. If you can do it, think carefully about trying to find the best professors, the ones who have reputations for being world-class teachers, the ones who are, and by the way, these are no secrets. They're not on the websites of these colleges, but if you go on a campus and you start asking around, you will hear the names of every one of these people instantly. Your job is to try and take a class with every one of them. Now, I know you still have to take certain courses to meet your major requirements. I get it. But if you can pick the professor, not the course. These are simple examples that bear out from our research. Now, here's the problem. If you say, geez, Brandon, what a bum report card on student engagement. How can we improve student engagement? Well, of course, there's a long list of things we can talk about. But through the lens of Gallup research, there's just one simple answer. The biggest driver of student engagement is teacher and staff engagement, right? I mean, this is not rocket science. Through the lens of human behavior and organizations, this is simple. The number one driver of student engagement is an engaged teacher, staff person, administrator. So here's a provocative idea. Principals, I would argue, their job is not to drive student engagement in school. Their job is to drive teacher and staff engagement. You see how simple but powerful that shift in the thinking is of a principal's job? Because if a principal crushes it on driving engagement among staff and teachers, they are inevitably having a powerful impact on every single student in that building. They have a better chance of touching every teacher and staff member from that perspective than touching every student, just based on sheer numbers. But here's the problem, and this is, I promise, the data. By the way, if you get overwhelmed by some of this data, here's a good technique for you. In our household, I've got a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and we have this thing that we call Zen frog it. So if our son Harrison is having a temper tantrum, we just go Zen frog it, Harrison. He does some ohms, om. So if anybody gets a little worked up over some of these data points I'm sharing, just Zen frog it. It'll start to feel better. Teachers of all professions in the United States, behind coal miners, truck drivers, and everybody else, are dead last on saying their opinions at work count. They're dead last on one of the most important elements of feeling empowered in their work. My opinions at work count. Look, I don't know how we got to this place, but shame on all of us that that's the case, that this prized profession of teaching, this thing that's the centerpiece of our healthy, thriving educonomy, is in a place where they feel like their opinions don't count. Here's a good one. We get worked up a lot over how we're doing in the U.S. in international standardized test comparisons, right? PISA, you've heard of PISA. And we don't look good on these measures right now. I mean, we're kind of like, you know, meddling scores in the 23 to 30 range of countries that are part of this study. And believe me, we need to do better on this. But here's just a simple thing to think about. Careful what you measure and careful what you're aiming at. Because this is interesting data where there's 32 countries where there's overlapping measures between PISA standardized test score performance and entrepreneurial energy and activity in the country as measured by the Global Entrepreneurship Measure. Both of these are data sets that are not Gallup data sets. But this is a really interesting piece of data to share because what they found is that there is a negative correlation between standardized test scores and entrepreneurial energy in a country. Now, I'm not saying these things are mutually exclusive. You can definitely have high test scores and high entrepreneurial energy, and we ought to aim for both. But it's just really interesting to point out that where we think we're suffering greatly on standardized test score comparisons, the U.S. still looks pretty darn good on our entrepreneurial energy and activity relative to other countries. Now, you say, through the lens of South Carolina competing, this is a pretty important one. What does the entrepreneurial energy and activity look like for our students in school today? This is an interesting challenge to all of you. What would you do to identify kids who have, let's say, an interest or maybe particular aptitude in becoming entrepreneurs? What are our schools doing today to identify that talent and interest in our classrooms? By the way, we're real good at talent identification and a whole bunch of other things. We find every kid who crushes it on a standardized test score. We find every kid who's a great athlete because, see, if you're a pro scout and you watch a guy drop back and throw a football in 7th grade, that scout can tell you right then whether they have the physical talent to play in the NFL. Isn't that, I mean, that's amazing, remarkable. See, if you have the eyes looking for the talent, we find it. We do this for musicians, right? We do this for artists, because those are things we can see. But what are we doing to identify kids with great entrepreneurial aspirations and interests? Right now, honestly, I mean, this is half true. It's half funny, but it's also half true. I think we do a better job identifying kids with entrepreneurial energy. What do we do with them? We're more likely to put them on ADHD meds than we are to put them in a program that might help them start a business. I'm just using this as one example. There are myriad talents in our schools, among our teachers and our students. And right now, we've got blinders on looking for a narrow set of these talents. And this goes back to the career and college-ready goals, right? We really mean college because, of course, you know, we don't hold it up as a great prize for somebody to go right into career or apprenticeship or whatever. I mean, by the way, career and technical training in the United States is going to have a massive resurgence. Why? Because we're starting to realize that a lot of middle-skilled jobs actually pay more money than some of the advanced degree fields that students are coming out of in postgraduate work. Welders in Louisiana, they can't find enough. Starting salary for welders is close to $100,000. You know what they're doing? They're importing welders from the Philippines because they don't have a pipeline in Louisiana that's filling the demands for the jobs there. There's a company there that won the contract to build all the ships for the U.S. Coast Guard. And the welders are coming from the Philippines, not from Louisiana. So shifting to what are we really aiming at here, it's important to measure grades and test scores and graduation rates, but what are we aiming at beyond that? And in simple terms, I think most of us would say something like, well, a great job and a great life, or a great career, and not just about a job, but to have, to be an engaged citizen and have a fulfilling life, right? If you ask yourself the question, what's the ultimate outcome of an education, you start to come up with much more profound answers and language than just simply saying graduation rates and grades. One of these things we've studied more than anybody in the world, and it's this idea I brought up earlier, well-being. Now, well-being, the way we've defined it, Gallup has found 5 crucial elements to the well-being of every human being. And they're basically described the way they are on this slide: purpose, social, financial, physical, community. Let me just point out a couple. Purpose well-being, we used to call it career well-being, but you can have high purpose well-being and be unemployed or retired, for example. It's liking what you do each day and having a chance to do it your best at each day. So you could hit the mark on those measures as a retiree. You could hit the mark on those measures as a stay-at-home parent. But the point is, those are really critical elements of your overall well-being. If you get purpose well-being right, the likelihood that you're thriving in the rest is extremely high. All 5 of these elements matter. That one matters more than any of them. Community well-being. Here's an example of where we're going wrong in the values we espouse to young people today. Community well-being. See how many of you can strongly agree to this question. In the last 12 months, I've received recognition for contributions made to my community. If you can strongly agree to that, you are among 7% of Americans who strongly agree. That's our gold standard question on community well-being. Here's the point. You don't get to that place by being loosely affiliated with 17 different extracurricular activities. You see where I'm going with this? I worry that we've told kids to pad resumes at the sake of missing the opportunity to be deeply, meaningfully engaged in any one of them. Now, I'm not saying don't encourage them to explore. Don't get me wrong, I think that's very important. But we also need to encourage them to think about sinking their teeth into something that they have a lasting involvement in over their 4 years of high school, or their 4 or 5 or, 7 years of college, depending on how long it takes. For the average American, it's now 6 years. This sounds like something nice to measure. But to my point earlier, this is not a soft measure. This matters a lot, because as it turns out that if you have a citizen in the state of South Carolina who's thriving in all 5 elements of well-being, they have 1/3 the healthcare cost burden to the state or their employer than an employee or a citizen who's not thriving in any. And you don't have to get everybody thriving in all 5, which is a relatively high bar. For every element, you can take somebody from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3 elements of well-being. The healthcare cost burden just keeps going down. Why is this important? Well, our national healthcare tab right now is about $2.7 trillion, going on $2.9 trillion. To put it in perspective, that's almost $1 trillion more than the entire Russian GDP. Think about that. Our healthcare tab in the US is bigger than the entire GDP of Russia. So some people could make a case that our country is on our way to bankruptcy because of our healthcare tab. Do you think well-being is a nice to have or a need to have? And like well-being, we measure this other thing called workplace engagement, the degree to which you're engaged in your work, whatever that work is. And there's questions that we found are linked to things like productivity, absenteeism, turnover. Here's the important point. Like well-being, engagement is not a nice to have, it's a need to have. In studies that we've done, if you have engaged employees, quite simply, they're more productive, they're less likely to be absent, they're less likely to steal from your organization, they stay there longer. If this is measured in for-profit companies, they produce more revenue and profit. All those things sound pretty important, don't they? Guess what the #1 driver is of those classic economic outcomes? They're behavioral economic measures of the people who work there. So let me just shift now to the next question. Is our graduates career and life ready? Because this is essentially the goal of our entire education system, that in some form or another we want to hit the mark on either one of these things or both of these. And look, this is not, it's interesting. We're having this whole conversation about the value of a liberal arts degree in our country right now. It's unbelievable. When you go and listen to panels at conferences about this, it's like, this is literally the discussion. It's either liberal arts or careerism, as if those two things have nothing to do with one another. And you go, really? Have we dumbed down this conversation so much that it's just liberal arts or careerism? It's not an either or, it's an and both conversation that we need to be having. There are elements of the liberal arts education that are powerfully connected to successful career outcomes. But it's almost like in the liberal arts, people don't want to talk about the career value of the liberal arts as if that's kind of beneath the liberal arts. I mean, we're having this bizarre talk. And then, by the way, career and technical training, a lot of the evolution in that side of the equation, right, if you want to try and draw a line between these things, has been about building things like critical thinking, skilled communication, collaboration, writing into those programs. Those things sound very liberal artish, don't they? I mean, here's the point. This is an and both conversation. We need to stop the stupid around making it an either or conversation. So our graduates' career and life ready. Let me just start with high school students first. And the first obvious thing we've discovered is that on anything that relates to a real work experience, either a real one or a simulated one, students are just woefully inadequate. Less than 5% of high school students are currently interning with a local organization in any form, and only 17% say they've worked an hour more in a paid job in the last week. So on these measures, very few students are getting any real crack at real work experience. What's interesting, though, is when we do a study of young Americans, this was a representative study of 18 to 35-year-olds looking at their experiences in school and the relationship with those experiences to their career success as young adults. We had a long list of things we studied in this particular project, all kinds of 21st century skill examples, whether you use technology to complete an assignment, whether you worked in a team, all kinds of things. But two bubbled up as having a relationship with work success as young adults. And they were whether these people strongly agreed to these two questions. Whether they worked on a project that took more than a few classes to complete, a long-term project, and whether they had the opportunity to apply what they were learning to solving a real-world problem. Now, does that sound like an overwhelming set of things to make happen in school? Not at all. But you look at the percentages who hit the mark on these things, and you get pretty down pretty quickly. What works in school looks like real work. And there's all kinds of ways to make this happen, from the obvious of internships and apprenticeship opportunities to the less obvious of project-based learning opportunities that are crafted around solving real problems. We can do this in every single class we teach. I've seen it in Intro to Spanish just as much as I've seen it in STEM courses where you can think of obvious examples of projects. Now let me shift to higher education. And this is an interesting one on the perceptions of how well we're doing on work readiness for college students and graduates. So Gallup, I have to admit, this was not strategic. We got lucky on this one because we asked a similar question in 3 different studies we did over the last 2 years. One was a survey of chief academic officers, provosts of colleges and universities. And as you'll see, 98% are confident that they're doing a good job preparing students for the workplace. 98%. In a poll of the general population of Americans, only 11% strongly agree that college graduates are well prepared for success in the workplace. So obviously, there's a lot going on here. I mean, the difference between 98 and 11%, there's some perception issues, there's communication issues, and there's probably some real fundamental skills gap issues. All of that is in the middle of that thing. That's a gulf so big I can't even explain it in statistical terms. But you go, well, Brandon, what does the general population know about the work readiness of college grads, right? Like, that's just, well, how about C-level business executives? This was the 3rd survey we did, a representative sample of C-level business executives, and it turns out their report card's even a little worse. 11% strongly agree that college graduates have the skills they're looking for in the jobs that they have open. So obviously, this is an example of we have a lot of work to do, and I think in a simple way, it starts with getting people in the same room together, just as is happening here this morning. Employers have to play a major role in this equation. It's no longer acceptable for employers to point the fingers at either higher education or K-12 and say, you're not giving me what I need. Unless and until they're clear about what they need and they start to step up and build real, lasting relationships with schools and colleges and universities to make sure that those things are happening. Employers can help teachers come up with project-based learning examples for the classroom based on real problems they're trying to solve on the assembly line at the BMW plant. They can offer internships and in much bigger numbers. And by the way, this isn't just the Fortune 500 companies because we think of them in obvious terms. What about all the small and medium-sized employers that are just down the street from any number of these campuses? We forget about them entirely. Students don't think about them because they don't know their name. They might not even know they exist. But where there's wide open opportunity here is connectivity between colleges, universities, school districts, and all the small and medium employers out there. The large ones are obvious, and so they get targeted, they reach out, they do a number of things. But if you calculated pound for pound the number of internships that Fortune 500s are offering based on their employee size, compared to small and medium-sized employers and the value that those internships have to them, I'll give you my example. I was a 7-employee firm in Boston as a startup. And someone from Northeastern's co-op office called me and said they wanted to have a meeting to talk to me about their co-op program. I wasn't looking for them. I didn't go on their website. But someone made a call and scheduled a 30-minute meeting with me. They came out, explained the co-op program. These students get 6 months to work in your company. You pay them $14 an hour. And I was intrigued on 2 levels because if they didn't work out, you send them back. They're getting paid, so I knew they were going to try and do a good job. And I got them for 6 months, which means that it wasn't the proverbial 6-week summer thing where you're like, geez, I don't know what I can have you do for 6 weeks. I'm going to have you copy some papers for me and get some coffee for us, right? I gave them real jobs because I was a 7-employee firm. The first co-op student we hired, Kim Durkin, we made our director of marketing because I didn't have a director of marketing. She literally got a real job. She did the real job. We hired her. We ended up having an 11-year relationship with Northeastern. Dozens of co-op students worked with us over that time, and they were amazing employees, not just interns. They helped move the needle on the performance of our company in very important ways. Here's the point. A 30-minute meeting from somebody at Northeastern led to an 11-year relationship and dozens of co-op opportunities in a tiny employer in the city of Boston. Guys, I don't think that this is impossible work to do, right? I don't think that this is impossibly costly work to do. This is not easy, but it's a change in what we value and how we spend our time. We don't need to issue billion-dollar bonds to increase the connectivity between employers and schools. We just need to issue some elbow grease. So now let me tell you about the things that we found about college that relate to success in the long run. The next 3 things I'm going to share with you, what we called being emotionally supported. If you strongly agree to any one of those, it doubles the odds that you end up engaged in your work over your lifetime and doubles the odds that you're thriving in your well-being. These are kind of career and life trajectory game changers in the grand scheme of things. Here's what they are. Ask yourselves these questions. These are 5-point scales. 5 strongly agree. I'm only interested in if you can strongly agree. If you can't, it's a no. So how many of you strongly agree that you had at least one professor who made you excited about learning? Just raise your hands. I'm curious. How's the room doing on that one? Pretty good. Almost everybody. Nationally, 64% of all college graduates strongly agree to that. Sounds like a pretty good percentage until you realize that about 4 in 10 don't. And it was only worded as at least one professor over their 4 or 5 or 6 years. Now, I ask the next question. This is a more broad one, right? Not a professor, but the professors at my alma mater cared about me as a person. How many strongly agree? Oh, see, the numbers are dwindling. About a third of the room, which is kind of consistent here. 27% of college graduates in the U.S. strongly agree to that one. Here, by the way, is the most important one. How many of you strongly agree that you had a mentor who encouraged your goals and dreams? Oh, wow. Please note that this is a special group. You're a very special group. That's unbelievable. I'd say, what, the official Gallup poll results, about half of you raised your hand? You guys think? Was that about right, about half? That's more than double the national average because it turns out only 2 out of 10 college graduates strongly agree to that question. And as odds ratios go, this one has the strongest relationship with engagement and well-being later in life. Here's the problem. Only 14% of all college graduates in the U.S. hit the mark on all 3 of these precious emotional support elements of college. Now, we also found 3 deep learning or experiential elements that also double your odds of being engaged in work later. They only have a little relationship with well-being. Okay, so these 3 are just as important for work engagement, but they only have a little relationship with well-being. Here's what they are. How many of you strongly agree that you had a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete? This is such an interesting one. Because less than a third of all college graduates hit the mark on this one. And you go, how is that possible that over 4 or 5 or 6 years, you didn't have one class that required a semester-long project or engagement? This one, to me, is inexcusable. But see, here's the trade-off that everybody's making rationally around this. The typical student and their parent, in looking at course selection, will take a course that's easier so they can get a higher grade than to take a course that's harder that might involve a long-term project. Not because they're lazy. There might be a few that's the reason. But I think they're making a rational choice because they've been told that a higher GPA is more important than a long-term project experience. And everybody goes, yep, that's the right call. Do that, Johnny. Take the easier course because you need that 4.0 or so-and-so is never going to hire you. Guess what? 80% of the world's experts in education, we did a survey of experts from 149 countries, 80% would rather hire a B student with an internship than an A student without one. And I'll go into a little bit of data, too, on these long-term project engagement because it's a part of one. But you go, less than a third of college graduates worked on a semester-long project. The next one, this is important. This is what we call a sorting question because we also asked a question whether you had a paid job during college, yes or no. If you say yes, that has no relationship with your workplace engagement later in life. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. You made a paycheck, right, that helped pay for some of the expenses of college, so not a loss on that. But as it relates to workplace engagement, just having a paid job doesn't have a relationship. But if you said you had a job or an internship, here's the really important words, where you applied what you were learning in the classroom, that doubles your odds of being engaged in work later in life. But you see the important difference? One is a job, the other one is a work experience connected to your learning. If those 2 things don't go together, we miss a huge opportunity. And so let me just finish on this point, and we'll open up for questions with any of the time we have left. This is a little more complicated chart. So the lighter color bars are the percentage of graduates who strongly agree to a question. Here's the question. I was well prepared for life outside of college. I mean, who better to judge that than the graduate themselves, right? What a simple question to ask people. I was well prepared for life outside of college. So that's the percent who strongly agree. And as you can see, it goes from 5% on the left to 85% on the right. Now, here's what the other bars are. It's the percent of college graduates who hit the mark on 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 of those 6 key elements that I just shared. Here's the first eye-popping result, that 25% of all college graduates are a 0 on that precious 6-question scale. If this was an auto assembly plant, we would recall a quarter of all of our graduates. Because the likelihood that those graduates say they were well prepared for life outside of college, 5% of them say they were well prepared. Keep in mind that 100% of the people in this data set met the academic requirements to receive a diploma from their institution. And yet, if you were on the left side of the scale that Gallup is measuring, only 5% of those graduates say they're well prepared for life. If you were on the right scale, this is a high bar, if you say strongly agree to all 6, how many say strongly agree to all 6? You are a 2.7%er. Congratulations. That's a pretty high bar to get. Now, I don't think that the expectation is that every graduate hits the mark on all 6 of these. That's kind of an unfair expectation. But don't you think it's fair to think that graduates hit the mark on at least 2 or 3 or 4 of these? Does that sound like a more fair way to think about this? The reality is that almost half of all college graduates are a 0 or 1 on this scale. But see, if you hit all 6, 85% of you strongly agree you're well prepared for life outside of college. So let me end there. I really appreciate the chance to be here with you today, and I hope these data and some of these ideas give you some real energy to think differently about what you're doing, what we're doing, and how we can get better. So thank you so much. Time on the session. Do we have time left on the session? 15 minutes. So I was hopeful for that, that we'd have time for Q&A. I don't know that there's microphones going around. Do you have microphones? If you get a microphone, great. If you don't, I'll try and walk to you so I can hear you and repeat the question. So would be happy to entertain some questions with the time we've got left. If you have no questions, I'm going to keep talking for 15 more minutes. It's in my contract. Where are we at? Okay, wonderful. Yes. Sally, good to see you.
Thank you for being here. Gallup, similar to the Gallup student poll, am I correct that you all do a teacher poll as well? Do you ask about teacher engagement? Do you have a survey that surveys teachers?
Yes, we do. So that's one of the little insights I shared about the one question that they're dead last on, of opinions at work count. Here's what we know about teacher engagement overall. Overall, they're not any more likely to be more engaged than the average U.S. worker. About 31% of all of us who show up for a job every day in the United States are engaged. Now, let me just describe the difference between engaged, not engaged, and what our researchers call actively disengaged. These are the 3 categories that the data gets lumped into. Engaged employees are the ones who bring all the new ideas and energy to the workplace. So if you say, hey, show up at 8 o'clock and engaged employees there at 7:30, if someone says on the way out of the door or on their way home, hey, can I get some help with this, Sally? You stay and help them out. You're thinking about work on the weekends, right? When you're in the shower and you go, oh, I got a great idea for blah, blah, blah. Employees who aren't engaged are not bad employees, okay? These are the folks who, you say show up at 8, they punch right in at 8, they punch right out of 5. They're not thinking about work on the weekends, but it's not like they're doing a bad job, right? They're showing up and they're doing the basics of their job. They're just not adding anything beyond that. Here's the problem. Actively disengaged, which 20% of all workers in the U.S. are, the best description I can give you is that if any of you have seen the movie Office Space, you know what I'm talking about. See, these people are not just passively miserable. they try to spread that misery to everybody else in the workplace. So see, if you have a great idea and I'm actively disengaged, I would just come pull up a chair and sit with you until that idea goes away. And I'm sure you have great ideas, Wendy, but I would make them go away, right? Okay, so just level set. So back to teachers. Overall, no more likely to be engaged than the average US worker. On some items, they look pretty good. On some items, like the one opinions at work count, they're dead last. But here's the fascinating thing very quickly about teachers. There's huge room for improvement in their workplace engagement. Huge room for improvement. But on well-being, this one's going to sound like, what do you mean, Brandon? On well-being, they're the second highest of all professions. Second only to physicians. You go, well, how are both true? Usually engagement and well-being go together, right? If you're thriving in your well-being, you're usually more likely to be engaged at work. But these are different constructs, and you can be engaged at work and miserable in your overall well-being and vice versa. Here's the point. As a profession, you could argue there's no better profession in the United States than teaching as it comes to having a great life. We didn't even control for income. If we had controlled for income between physicians and teachers, teachers would win by a mile. So this is the interesting thing. As a livelihood, right, teaching is as good as any profession somebody could go into for overall well-being. When it comes to workplace engagement, they're average as an overall score, and on the one I mentioned, dead last on opinions at work count. So just think about if we made a serious effort to think of all the ways that we could help elevate the opinions and input of teachers. Gosh, I mean, there's so many ways that we can do that. I don't know if I answered what you were trying to get at. But
I wanted to know how many educational, are you seeing a good many educational organizations and schools polling and surveying their teachers about this?
So that's a great question. Historically, very little interest from educational institutions at both the K-12 level and the higher ed level in doing this. And this is work that Gallup's done for 20 years. So, I mean, now, literally, we're going to pass the 30 million mark of the number of people we've surveyed about their workplace engagement this year, right? So 30 million people. But I will tell you right now that in the last 6 months, this is great news. I mean, it's great news through Gallup's lens, but I think it's great news for how we think about these things. We have had more school districts and higher ed institutions hire us to measure teacher and staff engagement than we have in the previous 30 years. So, you know, and look, there's many ways to do this. I'm not saying that as a sales pitch for Gallup. I'm simply saying that we need to start paying more attention to these other kinds of measures I've mentioned, right? Not just the classic traditional measures we've tracked in education, but some of these behavioral, what we would call behavioral economic or human qualitative measures, because they matter greatly, and in the grand scheme of things, the average school district in the US isn't paying any attention to those metrics. But it's not hard to do so. So, did somebody already have a mic teed up for? Okay, and then we'll come to you, Gloria. Yeah.
Yes, I'm lead an engineering company here we're nationwide, but looking at this slide, I see we've got people you said that as colleges we would recall, and the comment I would make, and I would ask you to speak to a little bit, we got a lot of people that are already out of the system. And that's our real world.
Right.
That's who we're working with. That's who we should be thinking about. And while it would have been better had their experience been different, the real world is that's who's in the workplace. Can you speak to perhaps some potential for corrective action on that aspect?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought it up because I kind of started there in a small way in talking about how 75% of currently enrolled college students today are adults. I mean, in the traditional sense, you know, non-traditional age sense, adults. It's never too late when it comes to learning and growth and development. Literally, never too late. And I think if we're going to be serious about putting our money where our mouth is on this concept of lifelong learning, because we all talk about that, right? We talk about that as a goal for ourselves, whatever. You know, we can't think about college as defined to this 4-year period between the ages of 18 and 22. We just got to blow up that as a singular definition of how we think about college. We also don't need to think about college as just a 4-year track, right? I mean, there is a massive revolution that's starting right now around all kinds of new certificate programs, boot camps, right? I mean, the term boot camps from a workforce development perspective is just booming all over the place, right? There's even boot camps. There's a startup company that I'm sure is going to do very well that is now doing boot camps for women who are coming back into the workplace after being mothers at home, right? I mean, so very specific work to say, okay, what can we do to get you back into the workforce? So here's the point. I mean, some of these things are not official degrees and credentials the way we've thought about them. Many of them are. You can enter into those at any stage in life. You know, here's an interesting one. One of the big booms in lifelong learning, and this is a business opportunity and an opportunity just in terms of how we improve our society, is with retirees. Because guess what? This is the baby boomer generation who's retiring with a lot of disposable income, and they know that keeping their brain active is actually good for their longevity and overall health. I mean, there's more research on this than we can shake a stick at. And so what's happening is, and this is true for my parents, they're retired, they spend some of their time in Florida, and when they're down there, they take courses at Florida Gulf Coast University, not because they're trying to get a degree or diploma, they have no interest in that, they just want to keep learning. And they're willing to pay money for those things, right? So here's, back to your point, I mean, there is an universe wide open to employers and educational institutions of all types, for-profit, nonprofit, officially accredited and not, to think about how we can curate work and learning experiences all through life. So one of the big themes in my education research that I hope I've talked about is how important it is not just to have a work experience, but to connect it to your learning. People who are already in work, there's no reason why we can't think of work and our workplaces as constant learning environments, right? And so some of these things are going to be formal, like I go to the community college and I take a program and I get a certificate. And some of these things can be informal, where you say, geez, we just got a lot of people who need to know the basics of accounting. I don't care if they get a certificate. I want them to take 3 introductory classes on accounting. And I'm just making up examples here, right? But I think there's a huge opportunity for employers to think about lifelong learning through the lens of professional development in very new ways. And by the way, there's going to be models. If colleges and universities don't step up to build these connections with employers and vice versa, you're going to see all kinds of examples of middlemen coming into the play, right? So here's an example. Why would the best employers in the world ever wait for a student to go to Stanford if they could hire that same student their senior year in high school? Let me be provocative for a minute on this point. Because, see, you get street cred in Silicon Valley the earlier you drop out of Stanford to become a computer programmer. So if you dropped out junior year, you're kind of cool, but if you dropped out freshman year, you're badass, right? And so the idea is that you go, well, okay, now I'm not saying anything to belittle Stanford, not at all, world-class institution, but my point is that if you're Google and you want a world-class developer, do you need to wait until they get their diploma from Stanford? You don't have to, unless you just make up a magic requirement that you have to have a bachelor's degree. The point is, the best talent in the world, you can identify it much younger than 22 years old graduating from college. And even if they go to college, you could have them in programs where you essentially pick them in high school, take them through the feeder system, but they're part of your feeder system at your company, right? So, a quick series of ideas around your point. I just think there's a wide open universe to think about lifelong learning through the connectivity between employers and educational providers. It's a great point. So, Gloria, you were next. Yes.
Yeah, so you said that the number one thing millennials want in the workforce is, you said the number one thing that millennials are looking for in the workforce today is growth and development.
Yep.
Can you expound a little bit on what that looks like to be effective for millennials? 'Cause
Yeah,
it's very different from what many of us grew up.
Yeah, no, so we're about a month away from putting out a major report on millennials, and we've studied it through so many different lenses. And so one of the big findings that's going to be released there is that point, right? That what they're looking for most is growth and development in the job they take, right? So their relationship with jobs is different than the relationship that, say, generations 20 or 30 years ago had, right? Where it was more of, I'm going to get a job, it's a paycheck to feed my family and live the American dream. Now it's more, I don't draw a line between my work and my life, right? There's a blending of this, and it comes out in ways where we criticize millennials, like, oh, they don't work hard, and they want a lot of time off, and they want to work from home a lot, and right. But here's the thing: in their psychology around this, they don't draw a line between work and their lives, right? So where they work, they want it to have a lot of meaning and purpose, and meaning and purpose comes to them in 2 lenses: their own growth and development, right? Am I learning? Am I growing? Am I developing? And also, do I feel that I matter through the lens of mission and purpose? Now, mission and purpose is obvious in nonprofits, but see, there's for-profit companies that create powerful mission and purpose if they just connect what they're doing to a bigger cause, a bigger outcome, a bigger ideal. And the important thing in here, this is the real critical linkage, that person has to see how their role contributes to that mission. You can't just be in an organization that's high mission and purpose if you don't feel like your role is contributing to it. You miss the whole point. You see, so it's not just, oh, we're a nonprofit, we have this powerful mission. No. I still have to make sure that people in their jobs every day feel like the thing they're doing is contributing to driving that mission, right? So now, what's down the list on their needs and interests and priorities at the bottom of every one of these is, benefits, even pay scale, right? The latte machines, the fancy, So it's not to say those things are more, if they're anything, they're icing on the cake. They're not the fundamental drivers of the millennial connection to work. So great question. Where we are in questions, I can't tell who was next, so we'll just, whoever gets the mic has it.
Right. Donna Toiber in Richland School District 2. So we have teacher leadership standards, and they're really great. Being able to give teachers in the classrooms and educators who are in schools that grassroots opportunity to try things, new ideas, to grow. But yet they say they don't have time, and that's the frustrating part, is how do we grow people who are caught in sort of this disconnect where we have the top-down test scores and achievement scores and, the pressure from parents and everywhere else and higher ed. And teachers are just stressed. I mean, they are quitting the profession because they don't have the opportunity to. They're passionate about trying things and they want to try things. So, are there any suggestions or ideas that you've seen that have been successful?
Well, it's such an important point. Here's what I'll say: it's up to brave leaders to help move us out of this rut, because we have created a system at a national level. Americans love accountability. Gosh, that sells, right? When we say accountability, we love accountability. But then you go, okay, well, what are we holding people and schools and things accountable to? And that's where you start to go, okay, well, if it's just test scores and grades, if that's all this is about, you get a very different outcome than you may be intending to aim at, right? And so, again, I'm not suggesting we throw out grades and test scores. I think what we need to do is have a much healthier relationship with them, right? Because right now, most of the testing, especially at a state and a national level, is in the service of accountability, not in the service of that student or teacher understanding how they can learn and do better. I mean, it's summative, not formative, right? And so, testing from a formative perspective, in other words, gives you feedback on how you might learn or do better. There's a lot of value in that kind of testing. Testing for the sake of accountability, it's something that a student does. A test score goes up to the district level, the state level, and the national level, and nothing of use ever comes back to that student, right? So now, you have to have some level of that, okay, but I think we've gone overboard on accountability and we've lost track of the power of these kinds of things, right? Because you could turn the assessment world towards formative feedback for parents and teachers and students, and now all of a sudden people are going to say, I want more of that, not less of it, right? If it's done right. But to your point, where I see leaders making a difference, it's that they're doing it in spite of the system, not because of the system. So I've seen great superintendent leaders who say, you know what, I care about these measures, right? I care about care, right? I'm going to measure these things, right? Russell Booker and District 7 in Spartanburg are one of them. But they can't drop the ball on test scores and grades because that's how they're being held accountable. So you see, we put them between a rock and a hard place. You got to keep your eye on the ball of the grades and test scores. And oh, by the way, if you want to care about teacher engagement and student engagement and all these other things that I've talked about today, you have to do it in spite of the system, not because of it, right? So here's the thing. They need to do a great communications effort around that, a big sales campaign around that, because they need to get parents to believe this. Because parents go, well, grades are the most important thing, or my kid won't get into college, or they won't get a job. And you go, yeah, grades don't matter. Let me just give you this one. This is a zinger. Google has stopped asking about grades and test scores of candidates who apply at Google because they found no relationship between grades and test scores and their success on the job. Now, just put that into perspective. This is the world's most admired employer. They're saying there's a whole bunch of other things we're looking for, but we're not looking for grades and test scores anymore. That is an unbelievable canary in the coal mine. And again, I want to stress this. I'm not saying we just throw those things out entirely. If we have the right relationship with those metrics, they're important and valuable. right? But they're clearly missing the mark on something that Google's looking for. And Google isn't just hiring white-collar jobs. I mean, they're laying fiber in cities now. I mean, these are all types of jobs, and they literally have just stopped asking for grades and test scores. That's the timeout.
Yep.
They're giving me the timeout from back there. Thank you. Thank you, George.
This on? Yeah, Brandon, thank you.
Thank you.